The courtroom fell silent, every eye fixed on the young boy standing before the judge. His small frame seemed even smaller under the harsh fluorescent lights, his eyes wide with a mix of fear and hope. His words, though soft at first, carried an unexpected weight. "You're my mom." The room froze. The judge, a woman of stern composure and unmatched experience, blinked in disbelief. She had heard many things in her time in the courtroom, but this was unlike anything she had ever encountered. The boy's gaze did not waver from hers. It was as if he had made up his mind, and now, in this crucial moment, his soul was laid bare. His words were not those of a child seeking attention or of a misbehaving kid trying to manipulate the situation. No, there was something deeper, more desperate in his eyes. Something that spoke of a longing that had been buried for far too long. The judge's hands trembled slightly as she gripped the edges of her bench. Her gaze shifted to the other people in the room, lawyers, social workers, even the officers standing at attention, but no one spoke. The courtroom was completely still. You could hear the faint echo of the boy's voice lingering in the air, reverberating off the walls. The words, "You're my mom," had stirred something deep within every person present, though they weren't yet sure exactly what it was. The boy's plea was more than just a statement, it was a cry for help, an unspoken wish for something that had been missing from his life for as long as he could remember. The judge, looking at him now, had no idea how to respond. She had seen the faces of countless children in her years of service, but this boy, he seemed different. There was an unspoken bond between them, even though they had never spoken a word before today. She had ruled over cases like his before, cases of neglect, abandonment, foster care. But this time, it felt personal. Her heart clenched. In the pit of her stomach, a deep understanding began to form. She didn't know why she felt it, but the boy's words pierced through her, finding a place in her heart. The silence stretched on as the boy stood there, waiting for a response. His innocence, his vulnerability, were written all over his face. And yet, in the same breath, there was strength in his stance. He wasn't just a frightened child standing before a judge, he was a soul yearning for connection, for someone to care. He had nothing left to lose. The judge's mind raced. Could she help this boy? What was the right course of action? How did she, someone who had never imagined herself in such a personal role, respond to this unexpected moment? Her eyes met his again. There was no easy answer. But in that moment, she knew one thing for sure, something had to change. The room buzzed with quiet whispers, the air thick with tension, but the judge remained still. Her eyes never left the young boy who stood before her. The weight of his words was something she couldn't shake. "You're my mom." Those words, so simple yet so profound, resonated deep within her. As the boy remained in place, his gaze never faltering, the judge's thoughts began to swirl. She had heard many heartbreaking cases in her time in the courtroom, children abandoned by their parents, families torn apart by tragedy, the daily reality of the brokenness in her community. But this moment, this boy, struck a chord she hadn't anticipated. His words weren't just about a child wishing for comfort. No, they spoke to a deeper longing, a desperate plea for the love and care that he had been denied for so long. The judge, whose name remained unknown to the boy, had always prided herself on being a professional. She was the one who made the difficult decisions, who saw the legal side of every case, the right call, the proper outcome. But in this moment, she couldn't help but feel the sudden stirrings of something unfamiliar, a deep, emotional pull. Her mind drifted to her own past, to memories of a younger version of herself, to the struggles that had shaped her into the woman she was today. She had grown up in a world not much different from the boy's. Her family had been far from perfect, and she knew the sting of abandonment all too well. But she had made her way through the darkness, found stability, and created a life that, though imperfect, had filled her with a sense of purpose. Yet, now, as she stood on the other side of the bench, overseeing another case, she was struck by the boy's courage, his raw honesty. Her role as a judge had never seemed more meaningless than it did in that moment. How could she sit there and merely pass judgment on this child when his words were so much more than a plea? He wasn't asking for legal help. He was asking for someone to see him, to care for him. And somehow, in the deepest part of her heart, she felt as though he was asking her. The silence stretched on, and the judge found herself fighting back tears. She quickly cleared her throat, trying to regain her composure. Her eyes darted to the other people in the courtroom. The social worker, the lawyers, even the court officers, everyone was watching her, waiting for her response. But the truth was, she wasn't sure what to say. The boy's statement was not one she had ever been trained to handle. Her job had always been about decisions based on the law. The rules. The policies. But here, before her, was a young boy with nothing but the truth. He had no tricks, no manipulations, only a heart that had been shattered by the very system she worked in. The words, "You're my mom," weren't just a wish, they were an expression of everything he had hoped for and lost. Her voice finally broke through the silence, her tone shaky but resolute. She stopped, unsure how to proceed. Her instinct told her to comfort him, to tell him that everything would be okay. But she knew that wasn't enough. It wasn't enough to just tell him what he wanted to hear. No, what he needed was action. He needed a future, a family, something she couldn't just give him with a few kind words. But in that moment, something inside her shifted. She knew she couldn't walk away from this. No matter what the law dictated, no matter what her responsibilities as a judge were, this boy needed someone, needed her. And for the first time in years, she felt the pull of something greater than the courtroom's sterile walls. She felt the undeniable call to be something more than just a judge. She could be the one to change his life. The boy looked at her expectantly, waiting for her to speak, to offer something, anything, that could fill the aching void he had carried for so long. The words, "You're my mom," echoed in her mind as she slowly stood from her seat. This wasn't the time for legal jargon. This wasn't the time for judgment. It was the time to make a decision, one that could change both of their lives forever. She swallowed, then said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I can't be your mom. But I promise you this. I will do everything I can to make sure you don't go through this alone." For a brief moment, the boy's face dropped, disappointment washing over him like a wave. But as he looked into her eyes, something shifted again. There was no anger, no defiance. Instead, there was a flicker of hope, tiny, but bright. He nodded slowly, his small face filled with a mixture of disbelief and gratitude. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice barely audible but filled with a warmth that made the judge's heart ache. The moment wasn't over, but it was the beginning of something far greater than either of them could have anticipated. The boy's name was Elias, though few people had ever taken the time to remember it. He had been in and out of foster homes for as long as he could remember, his life a blur of strange faces, unfamiliar homes, and the ever-present fear that he would be abandoned again. His eyes, wide and filled with curiosity, often hid the deep sadness that lay beneath, the scars from years of neglect and broken promises. Elias was a quiet child, not one to ask for much. He learned early on that silence was often the safest path, that if you didn't make waves, you might be left alone. But that didn't stop the ache inside him. He longed for a family, a place to belong, but every time he began to hope, that hope was dashed when another foster family sent him away or when his parents failed to show up at the scheduled visits. In his heart, Elias had always known that he wasn't like the other children. They had parents who loved them, who came to visit them at the foster homes, who would do anything to get them back. But not Elias. His visits were always a little lonelier, a little quieter. His father had been in and out of his life, and his mother, well, his mother was a mystery. He had been told she was gone, but no one ever explained what that really meant. As he grew older, the questions started to weigh heavier, and soon he found himself drifting through life, unable to connect with anyone. But when he met Judge Larson, everything changed, even though neither of them knew it yet. The courtroom had never felt like a home for Elias. It was a cold, intimidating place. But when he found himself standing before Judge Larson, a woman he had seen preside over countless cases, something inside him stirred. Maybe it was the way she looked at him that day, with an unspoken understanding, or maybe it was the fact that she had been kind, even when she didn't have to be. She had been the one who had ordered his transfer to another foster home, a decision that didn't seem to matter much in the grand scheme of things. But to Elias, it felt like more. Her decision meant that someone cared, someone was looking out for him. The weeks that followed had been filled with confusion. His new foster home wasn't perfect, but it was better. There was food, warmth, and even a couple of adults who seemed genuinely interested in his well-being. But it was still a far cry from the family he dreamed of, the kind of family where there was love, stability, and security. And so, Elias began to hold on to something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years: hope. The small, fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, someone in his life could be the person he so desperately needed. It was during one of the court hearings that it happened, the moment that would forever change his life. He had been sitting in the courtroom, waiting for his case to be heard. His eyes kept drifting toward Judge Larson. He didn't know why, but something about her presence made him feel a little less alone, a little less invisible. It was a simple thing, really. His case wasn't anything special, just another routine foster care hearing. But for Elias, it felt like the entire world was centered on this moment. It was when the judge addressed him, her eyes softening just a little, that it hit him. She wasn't just a judge to him. She was someone who saw him, who noticed him in a world that often ignored children like him. In that moment, he felt something inside him break open. It wasn't just a desire for a mother. It was something deeper, an overwhelming need to be seen, to be cared for. And then, without thinking, without planning, he spoke. The words just came out, spilling from his lips in a rush of desperation: "You're my mom." The silence in the courtroom was deafening. Even Elias could feel the weight of the moment, the shock that rippled through the room. He hadn't meant to say it, but once it was out there. Once those words hung in the air, he knew they were the truth. For just a moment, he had allowed himself to believe that she could be the mother he had always dreamed of. As soon as he spoke those words, he immediately regretted them. He saw the judge's shocked expression, the way her brow furrowed in confusion. He saw the others in the courtroom turn to look at him with pity or surprise. His heart sank. He had said something wrong, something that no one could understand. But then, as quickly as the shame filled him, something changed. The judge's eyes softened. She looked at him with a mixture of concern and something deeper, something that made Elias's heart race. She wasn't angry. She wasn't dismissing him. Instead, there was a look of understanding, of empathy, that made him feel a little less alone in the world. Elias couldn't have known it then, but that moment, his desperate cry for love, was the beginning of a long journey that would change both his life and the judge's life forever. Elias didn't remember much about his early years. The details were scattered, like fragments of a broken mirror that no one had bothered to piece back together. What he did remember, though, was the pain, the sharp, jagged ache that filled the hollow spaces of his heart. His memories of his mother were few, but they were enough to haunt him for years. She had been young, beautiful even, but also lost in ways he couldn't understand as a child. He remembered her smile sometimes, and other times he recalled the emptiness in her eyes when she looked at him, as if he were a reminder of everything she couldn't handle. Elias had been told that his mother had died when he was just a toddler, but the stories he heard from the people who cared for him were conflicting. Some said she had overdosed. Others claimed it was an accident. He didn't know the truth. What he did know was that his world had shattered the day she was no longer there. And as the pieces of his life scattered, so too did his connection to anything resembling stability. His father, once a figure of strength in his life, had faded even faster. At first, there had been weekend visits, a few brief moments where Elias could pretend that life was normal. His father would show up at the foster home, clean and sober, with promises of brighter days. But those days never came. As time passed, Elias's father's visits became less frequent, then non-existent. The letters stopped, the phone calls never came. And when Elias finally confronted his father about the long absence, the words that came out of his father's mouth were nothing but empty excuses. The pain of abandonment wasn't just a shadow, it was a constant presence in Elias's life, haunting him even in the moments when he tried to push it away. The uncertainty of his future was always looming. Would the next foster family be better? Or would they be just like the others, kind for a while, but eventually cold and distant, unable to really love him? Through all of this, Elias had learned how to protect himself. He learned to hold his emotions close, to never let anyone see how badly he wanted to belong somewhere. He figured out how to be invisible, how to disappear into the background, blending in with the furniture in the homes that were never really his. But the weight of being invisible was growing heavier. And that's where Judge Larson came in. For the first time in his life, someone had looked at him and seemed to see him, not just the case or the numbers or the legalities of his situation. She had noticed him. And somehow, for that brief moment in the courtroom, he had allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, someone could care for him in the way he had always wanted. But after his words to her, Elias wasn't sure what would happen next. Would she push him away, tell him that he was just another case to her? Would the courtroom, with all its coldness and detachment, swallow him whole like it had so many others? His heart beat faster as he watched Judge Larson stand up from her seat. He had said too much. He had gone too far. And now, there was no turning back. Judge Larson took a deep breath before speaking, her voice steady, yet soft. "Elias," she began, her eyes locking with his, "you've been through more than any child should have to endure. No one should have to grow up feeling this alone. But I want you to know that you don't have to be alone anymore." Elias blinked, unsure if he had heard her right. His mind raced. Was this real? Could she actually be telling him that things might be different? That he might not have to live like this forever? "While I can't become your mother," Judge Larson continued, her voice unwavering, "I will do everything I can to help you. You deserve a chance at a real future. A chance at a family. And I will make sure that happens." The room was silent once again, but this time, the silence felt different. It wasn't suffocating or awkward, it was filled with possibility. Elias's chest tightened as a lump formed in his throat. The tears that he had spent so many years keeping at bay finally began to rise. He fought to hold them back, not wanting to seem weak in front of the judge or the others. But it was no use. He had never known a moment quite like this one. A moment where someone actually cared. For the first time in his life, Elias allowed himself to hope. Hope that, maybe, things could be different. That maybe, just maybe, he could have the family he had always dreamed of. In the days that followed, Elias couldn't stop thinking about the judge's words. "I will do everything I can to help you." They echoed in his mind, filling him with a mix of hope and fear. He had spent so many years trying to protect himself from disappointment, bracing for the inevitable rejection that came with every new foster home, every new family that didn't really understand him. But this time, there was something different. The words hadn't been empty, like so many others. The judge's promise felt like a lifeline, something tangible that he could actually hold on to. Judge Larson, too, couldn't shake the boy's words. They haunted her as she left the courtroom that day. She had made countless decisions in her career, some easy, some difficult, but none had ever felt quite as personal as this one. When Elias had called her Mom, it had felt like a weight had been dropped on her chest. She had never thought of herself as a mother figure, not even in the context of her job as a judge. But Elias's desperation, his plea for love and care, had touched her in ways she couldn't fully understand. As she walked out of the courthouse, her mind replayed the moment over and over. Was she doing the right thing? Was she truly equipped to help this boy, to be the support he needed? She had always seen her job as being about upholding the law, maintaining order in a chaotic world. But now, in the quiet of her car, she began to wonder if there was more to justice than just enforcing the law. Maybe, just maybe, justice also meant showing compassion, offering guidance to a child who had been failed by the system. Judge Larson's own childhood had been far from perfect, and perhaps that was why Elias's story resonated so deeply with her. She had grown up with a single mother who worked tirelessly to keep food on the table, who sometimes didn't have enough energy left to truly be there for her. She understood what it felt like to long for more, to feel as though you were slipping through the cracks, unnoticed. That thought lingered in her mind. She could be more than just a figure in the courtroom. She could help Elias find a future, a place where he didn't feel lost anymore. But how? And what if she couldn't live up to the promise she had made? The weeks that followed were a blur of phone calls, meetings, and legal paperwork. Elias was still living in his new foster home, and things had improved slightly, but the pain of his past still weighed heavily on him. He would often stare out the window, his gaze distant, as though he were waiting for something. The other kids in the foster home tried to be friendly, but it was clear that Elias was different. He didn't quite fit in. He wasn't angry, but he had a quiet sadness that seemed to linger around him. One evening, after dinner, Elias found himself sitting alone in the corner of the living room. His foster parents were watching TV, the noise of the program filling the room, but he felt as though he were in another world. His mind kept returning to the judge, to the courtroom, to her words. He had tried not to get his hopes up, but they kept creeping back. What if she could actually help him? What if, somehow, she could make everything right? But then the doubts crept in. Would he always be the troubled kid? Would he ever be able to be part of a real family, or would he always be an outsider? Just as these thoughts were starting to consume him, his phone buzzed on the coffee table. He picked it up, surprised to see a message from the social worker who had been handling his case. It read, "Elias, I need to meet with you and Judge Larson. She's got something important to discuss with you." Elias's heart skipped a beat. Could it be? Was this the moment he had been waiting for? The next morning, Elias was nervous. He wasn't sure what to expect. His stomach twisted as he walked into the small conference room at the courthouse, where Judge Larson was waiting for him. She was sitting at the head of the table, her eyes kind but serious. "Elias," she said, her voice gentle, "I'm glad you're here. I want to talk to you about your future." The social worker was also present, standing off to the side with a warm, reassuring smile. "Elias," she said, "we've been talking about what might be the best next step for you." Elias sat down slowly, unsure of what to say. He didn't know what kind of future they could offer him, but he couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope rising in his chest. Judge Larson leaned forward, her hands folded in front of her. "Elias," she began, "I've been working with the social workers and your foster care team to find a solution that will give you the best chance at a stable future. We've been discussing options for adoption, but there's something I want to ask you first." Elias's breath caught in his throat. Adoption? Could this really be happening? The judge paused, letting the moment sink in. "Elias," she said softly, "I want to know what you want. This is your life, and I want you to have a say in what happens next. If you want to stay in your current foster home, that's okay. If you want to find a permanent family, we can explore those options too." Elias felt the weight of her words. For the first time in his life, someone was asking him what he wanted. Not what was best for the system, not what was easiest, but what he truly needed. I don't know, Elias said, his voice shaky. I just want to feel like I belong somewhere. Judge Larson's eyes softened. Elias, you deserve to belong. And I promise you, no matter what happens, we will find a way to make sure you feel at home. The tears that Elias had fought so hard to hold back finally came, streaming down his face. In that moment, he realized that his life could be different. There was hope. There was a chance for a future he had never dared to imagine. The following months were a whirlwind for Elias. After Judge Larson's promise, things began to move forward in ways he never thought possible. His foster parents, although kind, had never been able to offer him the stability he craved. But now, with the support of Judge Larson and the social workers, Elias had the opportunity to find the home he had longed for. It was a strange feeling, hope. He wasn't sure he knew how to handle it. For years, he had lived in a world of uncertainty, a world where hope felt more like a distant dream than something within reach. Yet, every time he saw Judge Larson in the courtroom, every time they spoke about his future, Elias felt the weight of her words settle deeper within him. You belong. But as much as he wanted to believe that things could change, part of him still feared the worst. What if this was just another promise, another fleeting moment of hope that would eventually fall apart? He had been let down before. And now that he was beginning to believe, that old, familiar fear gripped his heart once again. It was during one of the court hearings that things came to a head. It wasn't just about Elias's adoption anymore. It was about his future, about securing a place in the world where he could finally feel at home. The day of the hearing arrived, and Elias sat in his usual spot, nervously wringing his hands. His heart raced in his chest, his mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. He wasn't sure what was going to happen next. Would Judge Larson find him a permanent home? Would she make it official? Or would he be back in limbo again, pushed from one home to the next, never truly finding a place to belong? Judge Larson entered the courtroom, her presence commanding attention. She took her seat, her gaze briefly meeting Elias's before she began the proceedings. As the case unfolded around him, Elias tried to stay focused, but it was impossible. His eyes kept darting to the judge, to the papers in front of her. He couldn't help but wonder, was this the moment? Was this the day his life would finally change? The attorneys presented their arguments, the case continued, but for Elias, nothing seemed to matter except one thing, Judge Larson's decision. He had been waiting for this moment, the moment when she would finally put her words into action, when she would show him that he was worth fighting for. When the time came, Judge Larson called Elias to the stand. He stood, his legs shaking slightly, as he walked toward the front of the room. The eyes of the courtroom followed him, but all he could see was Judge Larson, her gaze focused on him with the kind of warmth and understanding that he had never known before. She cleared her throat before speaking. Elias, she began, her voice steady and clear. I know this hasn't been an easy journey for you. I know you've been through more than any child should have to endure. But I also know something else. You have strength. You have hope. And that makes you different. Elias's heart thudded in his chest. He couldn't believe it. This wasn't just another court case. This wasn't just another decision that would send him to another temporary home. This was something real. Judge Larson continued, Elias, I've spent time thinking about your future, and I want you to know that I believe in you. I believe that you deserve more than what you've been given. And today, I'm going to make sure that you have the chance to live the life you've always dreamed of. Elias's breath caught in his throat. This was it. The moment he had been waiting for. The judge's voice softened, filled with compassion. Elias, I'm ordering that you be placed in a permanent adoptive home. And I'll make sure that happens as soon as possible. You will not be alone anymore. You will have a family, and you will have a future. Tears welled up in Elias's eyes as the courtroom erupted in murmurs of surprise and approval. For the first time in his life, he felt the incredible weight of the judge's words. He wasn't just a case anymore. He wasn't just a number in the system. He was someone who mattered. He was someone who had a future. As Elias walked back to his seat, he felt a sense of peace that had eluded him for years. This was real. This was happening. And it was more than he had ever hoped for. But the moment didn't end with the decision. As Judge Larson left the courtroom, she paused for a moment. She turned toward Elias, her gaze locking with his. And in that brief, silent exchange, something passed between them, a recognition, a promise, that could not be spoken with words alone. Elias smiled, a small, hesitant smile, but it was real. It was the smile of a boy who had finally found a place to belong, a place where he could feel safe, loved, and cared for. It was the smile of a boy who had finally found his family. In the weeks that followed the courtroom decision, Elias found himself caught between disbelief and quiet joy. He had lived most of his life with walls around his heart, guarding it against the pain of abandonment. But now, for the first time, those walls began to crumble. The promise made by Judge Larson, the decision to find him a permanent home, was finally becoming a reality. The social worker, a kind woman named Jessica, was the one to tell him that they had found a family who had been waiting for a child like him. They were a couple who had been fostering children for years but had never been able to adopt. They were kind, patient, and eager to offer Elias the stable home he had always dreamed of. As Jessica spoke to him about the family, Elias couldn't help but feel a mix of emotions. There was excitement, of course, but also fear. What if they didn't like him? What if he didn't fit in? What if this new family, like all the others, would eventually push him away? He remembered the first time he had been placed in a foster home, the excitement of meeting new people and the hope that it might finally be the one to work out. But over time, that hope had faded, replaced by a sense of abandonment. He didn't know if he was strong enough to keep hoping, to keep trying. But then Elias thought of Judge Larson. He thought of the way she had looked at him in the courtroom, how she had promised that he wouldn't be alone anymore. The judge wasn't just offering him a home, she was offering him the belief that he could be loved, that he was worth fighting for. One afternoon, just as Elias was beginning to settle into his new routine, Judge Larson invited him to meet the family that would adopt him. They had arranged for the first meeting to take place at the courthouse. Elias's heart raced in anticipation. This was real. This was happening. As Elias walked into the courthouse lobby, he saw the family waiting. There was a man and a woman, both with warm smiles on their faces. Elias could feel their gaze on him, and for the first time in years, he didn't want to hide. There was something in their eyes that made him feel seen, like he wasn't just a boy with a broken past, but a boy with a future, a chance at a new beginning. The couple greeted him with open arms, their kindness overwhelming. "We're so happy to finally meet you, Elias," the woman said, her voice gentle but filled with genuine warmth. "We've been looking forward to this day for a long time." Elias smiled hesitantly. His chest tightened, and he struggled to find the words to say. But when the man crouched down to his level, extending his hand, Elias felt a sense of comfort that he had never experienced before. "You've been through so much," the man said kindly, "but we want you to know that we're here for you. We're ready to be your family." For a moment, Elias could hardly believe what he was hearing. He felt like he was in a dream. Like everything was too perfect, too good to be true. But then the woman reached out and gently touched his shoulder, a reassuring gesture that filled him with a sense of peace. And that was when it all hit him. The family he had always wanted, the love he had always longed for, was right there in front of him. It wasn't a dream. It was real. The meeting lasted for hours, with laughter and shared stories, but it wasn't until they left the courthouse that Elias truly began to process what had happened. He was going home. He was going to have a family. As the car drove away from the courthouse, Elias looked out the window, watching the world pass by. He felt an odd sense of calm. He had always imagined what this moment might feel like, finally being part of something, finally having a place where he was truly wanted. But now that it was happening, it felt different than he had expected. It felt like hope. Real hope. But even as he felt this sense of peace settle into his heart, he couldn't help but wonder. Was this too good to be true? For so long, he had been let down by the promises made by others. What if, once again, he was destined to be abandoned? Those questions lingered in the back of his mind, but this time, they didn't take root. Instead, Elias focused on the warmth of the family that was now his. He wasn't just being placed in a new home, he was being accepted, loved, and valued for the first time in his life. The first days in his new home were nothing like Elias had imagined. It wasn't perfect, there were moments of uncertainty, moments when he wondered if he truly belonged, but something was different this time. This wasn't another foster family who would send him away when things got difficult. This was his new life, a life where he wasn't just a case number or an afterthought. He was Elias. He was part of a family. The couple, Sarah and Liam, were everything he needed in parents. Sarah, with her soft smile and quiet strength, had a way of making him feel safe. Liam, on the other hand, was a bit more energetic. He liked to joke around, to make Elias laugh. The two of them made it clear, in both words and actions, that they were in this for the long haul. They weren't interested in just being caretakers, they wanted to be his family. And slowly, through their consistency and care, Elias began to believe it. But it wasn't easy for him. After years of moving from one home to another, it was hard to trust that this was real. Elias had always been told he was loved in the moment, but when things got tough, when the novelty of a new child wore off, he was left behind. And so, even though Sarah and Liam had made their intentions clear, Elias found himself holding back, unwilling to fully embrace the love they were offering. One evening, about a week after his arrival, Elias found himself sitting on the edge of his bed, his thoughts swirling. He had just finished another dinner with Sarah and Liam, and everything had gone well. Too well. The warmth of the meal, the laughter, the conversations, it all felt so normal. But in Elias's world, normal was dangerous. Normal meant that sooner or later, it would all crumble, just like it had so many times before. He hadn't expected to feel so much. He hadn't expected to care so much. But it was impossible to ignore the love that Sarah and Liam showed him. Every little act, a hug, a smile, a word of encouragement, was a reminder that, for the first time, he wasn't just a child in the system. He was someone who mattered. And the thought scared him more than anything. Because if he let himself care, if he let himself truly believe that this was his new life, the pain of losing it would be unbearable. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. Elias didn't have to say anything. Sarah opened the door slowly, her face soft with understanding. She had been noticing the quiet, withdrawn version of Elias lately, the version that seemed afraid to fully let go. She stepped inside and sat on the edge of his bed, her presence gentle, not forcing anything. "Hey," she said quietly, "can I talk to you for a minute?" Elias swallowed, feeling the familiar tightness in his chest. He wasn't sure how to respond, but he nodded, not trusting himself to speak. Sarah took a deep breath, as if choosing her words carefully. "Elias, I know you've been through a lot, more than most kids could even imagine. And I know it's hard to believe that things can change, that people can really care. But I need you to know something. You don't have to be afraid anymore." Elias's heart pounded in his chest. He couldn't bring himself to look her in the eye, but he didn't turn away either. He wanted so badly to believe her, but the fear was still there, gnawing at him. What if this was just another empty promise? You've been through so much, Sarah continued, her voice steady but filled with emotion, and it's okay if it takes time for you to trust us. We understand. But I need you to know this, Elias, we're not going anywhere. You are our son now. You don't have to hide from us. You don't have to protect yourself anymore. Elias blinked, the weight of her words sinking in. For so long, he had built walls around himself, convincing himself that if he didn't care, he wouldn't get hurt. But now, sitting here with Sarah, feeling the warmth of her words, something inside him shifted. I'm scared, Elias whispered, his voice trembling. What if you leave too? Sarah's eyes softened with empathy, and she reached out to gently take his hand. Elias, we're not going anywhere. We promise. This is your home. And we're going to be here for you, no matter what. In that moment, Elias felt something inside him break. It wasn't the kind of break that shattered him, but the kind of break that let the light in. It was a quiet, subtle thing, but it was there, the beginning of real trust, real hope. Over the next few weeks, Elias began to open up more. He spent more time with Sarah and Liam, enjoying the simple moments, a Saturday morning spent baking cookies with Sarah, an afternoon walk with Liam in the park. It was a slow process, but it was progress. Elias was learning, step by step, that love wasn't something that disappeared when things got hard. Love was something that grew stronger over time, rooted in trust and understanding. And as Elias began to trust his new family, something else began to change. He stopped seeing himself as a victim of the system. He stopped seeing himself as someone who didn't belong. He began to see himself as part of something bigger, something more lasting. He was no longer just a foster child. He was Elias, son, brother, and, for the first time in his life, a part of a family that was there to stay. A few months had passed since Elias had been officially adopted by Sarah and Liam. Though it had been a relatively short period, Elias's transformation was nothing short of remarkable. He had gone from being a quiet, withdrawn child who had learned to hide his pain, to a boy who was finally learning how to embrace love and trust again. His smile, which had once been rare, was now a familiar sight at the dinner table. He laughed more freely, his shoulders no longer weighed down by the burden of uncertainty and fear. But there was one moment that stood out to Elias more than any other. It wasn't a big moment, not some grand event, but rather a quiet evening at home that perfectly encapsulated everything he had been through and everything he had learned. It had been a long day of school and errands, and the family was winding down for the night. Sarah and Liam were in the kitchen, preparing dinner, while Elias was sitting at the table, reading a book. The house was warm, full of the sounds of a normal, happy home, voices, laughter, the clinking of dishes. And then, out of nowhere, Elias heard Sarah's voice call to him from the kitchen. Elias, could you come help with something? Elias put his book down and walked into the kitchen, finding Sarah at the counter, preparing the vegetables. She looked up at him with a smile, her eyes warm and encouraging. You know, she said, when you first came here, you didn't talk much. You kept to yourself a lot. But now, you're a part of this family. And I want you to know that you don't have to hide anything from us. If something's wrong, we'll work through it together. Elias stood there, his heart racing. In the past, he would have shut down, would have retreated back into his shell. But now, there was something different, something inside him that made him want to speak, to share what he was feeling. For the first time, the words didn't feel like they would break him. I guess I was afraid, Elias said, his voice barely above a whisper. Afraid that if I let myself care, it would all fall apart again. But I realize now that I don't have to be afraid. You and Liam, you've shown me what it means to belong, and that's something I never had before. Sarah's eyes softened, and she reached out to gently pull him into a hug. You're our son, Elias. And you always will be. No matter what happens, we'll be here for you. You can trust us with your heart, because we'll never let you go. Elias felt the full weight of her words. Trust had never been easy for him, but with every passing day, he was learning that some people, some families, were worth trusting. They didn't just promise to care for him, they proved it in every action, in every quiet gesture of love. He had always believed that love was fleeting, that it was something that only existed in moments of happiness, moments that were too easily lost. But now, as he stood there in the warmth of his new family, he realized that love wasn't just something that happened when things were easy. Love was something that grew stronger with time, even through the challenges and the scars. It was something that stayed, something that rooted itself deeply in the heart. That night, after dinner, Elias sat by the window, looking out at the stars. He thought about everything he had been through, the loneliness, the fear, the years of wondering if anyone would ever really care. But now, he knew the truth. He had a family. And that truth was enough to fill him with a sense of peace that he had never known before. As he closed his eyes, a quiet smile spread across his face. He was home. For the first time in his life, he had found a place where he truly belonged. And in that moment, Elias realized that no matter how difficult the past had been, no matter how many times he had been let down, there was always the possibility of a new beginning. A beginning filled with love, with hope, and with the kind of trust that only time could build. The journey wasn't over, but Elias had come a long way. And he knew that, with his family by his side, he was finally ready to face the future.